Essentially, the role of a manager is to develop goals with an artist and then execute those goals by coordinating the correct team of people to work with you and making sure that each member of that team is doing their job correctly for the ultimate goal of the artist. You develop goals with an artist by finding out what they want to achieve, and if there's any stipulations or special concerns of an artist in how they achieve those goals. Essentially, you are trying to look forward to the different stages of an artist's career and set immediate goals and long-term goals and execute the details necessary to get to each stage of that artist's career. Essentially, there is no typical day for a manager because the task can vary so greatly depending on what's going on in an artist's career at any given time. One day I may be in New York visiting with the label and coordinating the people at the label that are working on an artist project. Another day I may be on the road with the band, meeting with promoters and paying attention to the development of the band themselves. And quite a few days I'm in the office on the phone and emailing and essentially trying to develop the plan for the artist. First and foremost, a manager is drawn to the talent of an artist, and you ultimately have to believe in the talent of an artist to believe that they could be successful. You're also drawn to artists who are intelligent and understand what it takes to develop their career. And if you think an artist is going to be an easy person to work with, that certainly would draw you further into working with them. Certain artists are very talented, and you may believe that they are not going to be quite as easy to work with, or that they might prove difficult in some areas, but you might weigh that against the level of talent, and if you believe enough in them and you feel like you can work with them to get them to a point where they understand the things that they need to do and how things need to be done if they're ultimately going to be successful. Typically, managers are looking for artists, going out to hear bands, talking to their friends, and hearing about an artist, and an artist may be approached by a manager. If an artist is not being approached by managers, proactively, they can send out packages and work through any connections possible to get a CD, a press package, in the hands of a manager. The hard part is that most managers, when they get packages, they're typically overrun by the number of packages they're getting, and they're not going to pay specific attention to a package that just shows up in the mail. That's why it's best if you can find any kind of contact, friend, someone that can hand deliver a CD or package to a manager. I know that if I have someone that I respect musically that hands me a package and says, listen to this artist, I think that they have a lot of talent, then I will pay special attention and listen to that artist and give it special consideration. Whereas if one just shows up in the mail, typically I would not. It's a difficult process for a band, especially at the early stages, to get managers to pay attention. And essentially, I think an artist just has to think about any connections they have, any people they know, and anyone that they could get to hand deliver packages to managers, and then follow up with phone calls, and be persistent without going over the line and being annoying. But certainly persistence pays off in every area, so that could help greatly. This really depends on your relationship with a given artist. Some managers choose to stay completely out of all creative decisions or affairs, and certainly that's fine. That doesn't have to be the role of a manager. Certain managers are very involved in the creative process, and artists look to them for their opinion. And as with everything involving your relationship with an artist, it's a developing process of finding where that artist needs help and where the artist wants your help. And so if I find that an artist is looking for some creative input, and I'll certainly be there to offer my advice and give that advice in such a way that they know that they can take that advice if they'd like to use it, or they can listen to other people as well. But I certainly try and wait until an artist asks me for creative advice before I offer that kind of advice, because it can be a tricky situation, and certain artists don't want creative advice, and I think that's fine. Essentially, again, it just comes down to your relationship with any given artist, and how involved they want you to be and how involved you want to be in the creative process. This can be one of the most difficult areas for a manager, and one of the most important for that reason as well, because you're trying to find out what an artist wants to do, their creative goals, and find a way to fit that into the business model that is the music industry. And that doesn't always fit perfectly, because other people have ideas about what an artist should be doing creatively, and they don't always match up with what an artist wants to do. I feel like it's the responsibility of the manager to try and fit what an artist wants to do into that system as easily and closely as possible without an artist having to compromise what they want to do. At times you might help an artist change direction or slightly alter the way that they go about something so that it better fits the way the industry works. But typically you want to try and affect the people that you're dealing with in the industry and the way that you go about it, so that you can most purely develop the artist's career the way that they want it. Which it can be a difficult process, but essentially is one of the roles of the manager. Primarily, when you're developing the strategies and goals, you want to sit down with an artist and find out what they want to try and achieve. You want to find out what their goals are, and then you want to explain to the artist what you think their goals should be and where you see their career developing, and ultimately come to an agreement where you have a shared vision of what those goals should be after quite a bit of discussion, so that you can tell an artist what you think should be done, they can tell you where they want to go, and ultimately you can come together with a unified vision. Once you set those goals, and there's different levels of goals. You want to set goals, immediate goals, whether it's in the next 2 months, goals for the next year, and goals for the future of where you see their career in 5 to 10 years down the road. And you want to set those goals, make sure that the immediate ones are achievable goals, and you can get more lofty with your goals further down the line. And then measuring those goals, there's so many indicators that it really depends on what those goals are. If it's a touring goal, you may be measuring that on ticket sales or gross. If it's a recording career that's your goal, it may be album sales. You may also be measuring a career based on less hard facts and more on how has the buzz developed of a band in a certain market or nationally. How has the press perceived the artist? And those may be ways to measure the career without being able to rely on hard facts. Communication is, I think, the most important part of management, or one of the most important parts. And I've noticed when I've seen failed management relationships, it's typically been because of poor communication. So you have to make sure that you are communicating frequently and in depth with each artist and with every member of the team, and making sure that everyone knows that you're on the same page and everyone knows what you expect out of them. And it's that communication that really lets you know if everyone's moving in the same direction, because you're constantly monitoring it by speaking with the individuals and making sure that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, that they know what they're supposed to be doing. And so really that communication is key. You're constantly on the phone or trading emails and just getting updates with each team member, whether they're the artist or a person with a record label or your booking agent, and just making sure that everyone is coordinating their efforts so that you can ultimately be successful. The attributes of a manager can really vary depending on management style. I think attributes that most managers share would be a good communicator, being able to deal with people very well and the intricacies that are involved in management. Certainly a good business sense overall is a key attribute of a manager, as well as being an organized individual. Lots of artists are typically good at the creative process and not as good at staying organized and having as good of a business sense. So essentially you're trying to fill in the gaps with your own attributes that any given artist might need. As well, an attribute would be a good eye for talent, a good ear for talent, and having the understanding to see talent when it's there and to have a vision for developing that talent. One misconception I think that people have with management and the music industry is that it doesn't have to follow the typical rules of business, which I think is untrue. In that, when you're running an artist's career, you're essentially running a small business, and there's certain key aspects of that which are true whether you're selling music or whether you're selling any other product. And I think that you essentially have to treat it like a small business, and there's quite a few of the normal strategies and formalities of business that you still have to adhere to. Now, it may not actually be as formal, and you can get away with certain things in the music industry as far as some formalities that you can in others, but I think that really it's the same thing. Any business is going to have to go by some of the same key principles, and the music industry is no different. Management is no different. You still have to lay out business plans. You still have to measure how it's doing based on key factors, and you still have to determine success, which often is determined by monetary results and whether a business and a artist's career is financially viable. Unfortunately, contracts are very important in the music industry and have to be viewed as a necessary evil. There's been too many times in the industry where artists or managers have gotten burned in a situation, and it's become well known that having things laid out on paper and having a document to enforce a plan is necessary. And I think with an artist and a manager, a contract between the two, it's a good exercise regardless, which is essentially you're putting something down on paper and you're laying out what's expected and how things are going to be handled monetarily, and it's a good process regardless. If you're entering into a relationship both as an artist and a manager, you should be viewing it seriously, and putting something down on paper shouldn't be a problem. Now, there are some situations where an artist and manager have a very strong relationship and they don't have a contract. I typically wouldn't recommend that, but there are situations where it is worked, and I would say it's a small percentage that's the case. Contracts in general, there's so many contracts and legal terms for an artist's career, whether it's contracts for shows, for live engagements, recording contracts, video contracts. There's quite a bit of legal paperwork that's involved, and it's all important and it's all necessary. And I think a lot of times people shy away from that end of it, and there's very few people who enjoy dealing with it. But you have to have it. If you don't protect your artist by having the proper contracts in place, it will eventually come back to haunt you. And if you don't cover every detail, it'll be that detail that comes back and causes a problem. So I think that the contracts are very important, that you have to ultimately embrace the situation, understand that it's important, find a good lawyer, learn a good amount about law yourself, which will typically happen from experience, reading through contracts and understanding them. But I think an understanding of law as you go along is very important. Having the right lawyer and getting the right contracts in place for your artist. The tour manager is a very important role in your touring operation, really the most important role, because that person is responsible for the entire touring team, all the people under the tour manager, and making sure that everything happens correctly and on time on the road. And there's a lot of attributes of a tour manager that make a good tour manager. And essentially, that person has to be very organized and has to have very good people skills, because they're dealing with the artists themselves and other team members, and it can be a very stressful and taxing job, because it's nonstop on the road. The tour manager is always on 24 hours a day, even when they're sleeping. They can have to immediately deal with the situation, and so that person has to be very good at a lot of things. They have to handle all the money on the road, and that's obviously a very important aspect of the job. And they have to make sure that everything happens on time, which can be difficult because there's a lot of variables on the road. They have to handle all the show settlement, which is an important role of the tour manager, in that they, at the end of a show, they go through all the expenses and the contract with the promoter and make sure that the artist is getting paid the correct amount, and make sure that that show was handled correctly by the promoter. And they have to handle every aspect of the accounting on the road, which is if they don't have a tour accountant, if you're not at that level, and most bands are not. So typically the tour manager pays for everything and handles the accounting involved in paying for everything, whether it's hotels or paying musicians, paying per diem, any kind of expenses other than that on the road. And then they have to keep tight records of those transactions so that it can be turned over to the manager and to the accountant at the end of a tour, and everything jives. Oftentimes, tour manager is responsible for the merchandise as well, counting in merchandise at the start of a show and counting it out with the seller at the end of a show. And essentially responsible for all that money as well, and making sure those records are kept correct. The tour manager is also responsible for advancing a tour, which means that they make a lot of calls before a tour ever begins and find out all the details, get answers to questions, get the timing of how it's going to run, book hotels, and get the overall plan for a tour so that they can make a tour book, and all the details can be laid out so everyone on the production team, everyone in the band, everyone with management knows how that tour is going to flow and what the travel plans are, and so that the tour manager can really work with the manager and plan things like interviews in studios or radio stations, and all the timing of that. And knowing that schedule ahead of time is very key to making those kind of plans. So the advance work that the tour manager does is really important. And then on the road, their role is very important, because they just make sure that everyone is doing their jobs, that the tour happens, and that shows are run on time and without problems. I think with the current state of the music industry, record labels are still very necessary if an artist wants to reach a certain level of success with a recording career. Physical CDs are still the predominant way that music is sold. digital distribution is still a very small percentage of the overall sales of music. And record labels have the ability to get CDs in stores and to get a certain level of visibility for a CD in a store. And so, as long as that's the case, and the record labels have the ability to distribute records correctly, and that is the medium, I think that they are necessary. And also, record labels act as a lender. It's very expensive to record albums, and most artists don't have the funds readily available to record an album and pay for it. And record labels act as lender for recording an album. They also pay for the marketing and the radio promotion of an album, as well as they have the personnel to handle that and execute that plan. It is possible to do that on your own by outsourcing or by having a team of people yourself that market and promote an album, but most people don't have that kind of infrastructure, and record labels do have that infrastructure. And I think as long as the industry stays the way it is, that record labels will really be necessary to sell a certain volume of albums. I think even when we get to the point where we're in a digital age, where music is predominantly distributed digitally, it will just change the role of record labels. They're going to be forced to change the way that they do business. But I still believe as a lender and as a marketing machine, that on some level they're going to be necessary. And I believe right now that they're very necessary, especially with regards to distribution of CDs, because it is so important to get the correct distribution, get the CDs in stores, get the placement in stores, and get the visibility there. That's an infrastructure that only record labels and distribution companies have at this point.